Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to our weekly podcast, Palestine This Week, with me, Nassim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, as always, it's a pleasure to see you again and discuss all the key events from the region.
Thank you very much, Nassim. It's a pleasure to be with you. I heard you'd recently fallen ill and hope you have a speedy recovery.
Oh, thank you. I've been unwell a few days now, but I'm on the mend, a lot better than I
Glad to
was
hear it.
over the weekend.
Mm.
So if I do stop for a sip of water, you'll know why.
By all means.
Um, I want to begin, of course, with the sad but unsurprising announcement by the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification Institute, which is part of the UN, which today issued a statement, and it basically said that the worst case scenario of famine is currently playing out in the Gaza Strip. So no, they haven't said it's famine exactly, but they are saying that the worst case scenario of famine is playing out in the Gaza Strip, and this is the body which classifies whether something is a famine or not. I think we are heading towards. Of course, we don't need a formal classification. I think many people can see exactly that Israel is using weapon of starvation as a weapon of war, and we will get to that later on.
Mm.
But let's begin with this new intervention by the IPC and what it said and what it signifies. Given that we've had a week of blaming the UN, not blaming the UN, who's
Mm.
responsible for the starvation, who's not responsible for the starvation in Gaza. So we will get to that later on, but let's begin with the IPC intervention.
Well, the IPC has very clear thresholds for determining various stages of malnutrition, of hunger, of famine. And in order to determine whether or not a particular situation has reached that stage, it needs to collect very precise data. In the case of the Gaza Strip, it's denied entry to the Gaza Strip by Israel, and therefore it can't issue the kind of formal determination that it would be able to do in Sudan or in Ethiopia or in other places. And so, therefore, it came out with this very alarming statement that makes clear that, according to the data at the disposal of the IPC, famine is already taking place in the Gaza Strip. I mean, one, doesn't even have to be a specialist in famine these days to make that determination. All you need is a screen. But at the same time, it has not used the formal determination for the reasons that I gave you. And of course, Israel and its apologists will say, see, they didn't say famine. Now we have now reached a situation where growing numbers of people are starving to death, rather being starved to death. And as in any other situation, it's of course the weakest and most vulnerable that die first, the very young and the very old. And as you know, there's been this case of this iconic picture of a mother holding a thoroughly emaciated child wearing a garbage bag as a diaper, as kind of representing the dire and horrific situation in the Gaza Strip. And it later emerged that the child also has cerebral palsy, meaning that he is, along with infants who cannot yet eat food, along with the very elderly who have chronic conditions and so on, among the most vulnerable. And what you had is this absolutely vile campaign by Israel apologists, including one of the most, sadistic propagandists for genocide, an individual in Britain by the name of David Collier, who basically has the BBC eating out of his hand and bowing to his every demand. Um, you know, thinks it's some kind of investigative journalistic breakthrough that he was able to confirm that this child has cerebral palsy. And therefore, the reason that he's wasting away has nothing to do with Israel's siege, Israel's starvation siege. It has nothing to do with the unavailability of specialized food or medicines. And that therefore, this picture is proof that the world is yet once again engaged in, wait for it, a blood libel. I mean, you know, anyone who's ever been a parent, a grandparent, an older sibling, or even an aunt or an uncle, anyone who's ever been around very young infants knows that children, under 6 months, sometimes longer, do not eat solid food. Um, their nutrition comes from their mother's milk or from baby formula. Um, and so you have a situation where you have the growing proportion of very young children who cannot eat, who are wasting away and being starved to death, while their parents, of course, are in much better condition because they can eat whatever scraps are available, and so we have this absolutely vile campaign by Israel and its flunkies, showing pictures of infants consisting of nothing more than skin and bones, with parents who, by comparison, appear relatively healthy, and body shaming the parents. Why are the parents stealing food from their own children? Why can't they share their meals with their kids? And this kind of absolutely outrageous stuff. That's unfortunately where we are at the moment, and also there's been more recent testimony from one of the doctors who spent several months volunteering in the Gaza Strip and has said that we have now reached the stage where you have thousands of infants and children whose body is beginning to consume itself, who are so wasted away that their body is beginning to consume their digestive tract as a final source of energy. And what this doctor, I can't remember his name for the moment, what he says is that this means that these children cannot be saved with proper nutrition alone. They will also need medical care if they are to survive and recover. And in the absence of sufficient medical care and so on, this doctor unfortunately predicts that thousands will die in the coming weeks and months, even if the siege is fully lifted today, because nutrition alone will no longer save them. So I think we spoke last week. I may have mentioned that I suspected that Israel will partially lift the murderous siege in limited fashion once it is confident that a point of no return has been reached, and once it is confident that even lifting the siege will come too late to save many, many Palestinians in the Gaza Strip from death. And in that way, it can kind of throw up its hands and say, it's not our fault. We did everything possible to supply these people, and so on. And that appears to be happening to a very limited extent now.
I think that there is a recognition, even within Israel, that Palestinians in Gaza are starving. But we saw last week there's an effort to shift the blame by saying the fault is on the UN side. The UN somehow has failed to distribute the food, which is in Gaza. So there was a real row between the UN, the Israelis, because of what we are seeing, the images that are coming out of Gaza. I mean, you had people like Hillary Clinton who intervened, Barack Obama, people who've never really commented on the situation in Gaza. They felt
Well,
compelled
sorry to
to.
interrupt you. They have commented, but they have commented consistently to support anything and everything that Israel is doing.
Yeah, that's right. So, returning back to the discussion last week about who is exactly to blame for this starvation in Gaza, which Israel itself seems to be acknowledging by blaming the UN. But then the UN shot back, and you had a number of other humanitarian workers, someone by the name of David Satterfield, who served as the US humanitarian envoy during the early months of the Gaza genocide. He said that, and I'll quote, this is from the Times of Israel, it is disingenuous, knowingly false for any party to assert that it is failure, lack of courage, or deliberate conspiratorial withholding of aid by the UN or international organizations that is responsible for the humanitarian suffering in Gaza. So that's what Satterfield is saying. Basically, the idea that the UN or any international body is behind the famine and the starvation in Gaza are responsible. So he's basically saying, no, it's Israel that is directly responsible for the famine and starvation in Gaza.
Yes, I mean, we need to understand that the way Israeli propaganda works is it will put out a lie. Typically, it will immediately gain widespread and authoritative traction within the mainstream media in the West, and after a while, the fraudulence of Israel's position will be exposed. And then it will seamlessly and shamelessly transition to the next line, and we begin the process all over again. So in this case, you may recall that, for a very long period of time, we were constantly told there is no hunger, there is no malnutrition, there is no starvation, and more recently, there is no famine. We had the case, it was, I believe, last year, where the US, I think it's called the Famine Early Warning Network. I believe it's related to the former US Agency for International Development, USAID, put out a report warning of incipient famine in the northern Gaza Strip. So this is before, the current phase that we're now discussing. And under pressure from the leadership, I believe from the USAID leadership itself at the time, led by, self-proclaimed genocide specialist, problem from hell, Samantha Power, under pressure from the Biden administration, under pressure from Israel, and its minions in Congress and so on. For the first time in its history, this early famine warning network, I think I've got its name wrong there, was forced to actually retract its report. Then we come to the current situation, just to refresh our memory. On the 2nd of March of this year, Israel having unilaterally reneged and repudiated the agreement with the Palestinians that had been reached under American auspices in January, imposed a hermetic siege on the Gaza Strip. And for months it was telling us, that there is absolutely no relationship between preventing the entry of any food, water, fuel, or electricity in the Gaza Strip and the conditions that were resulting in the Gaza Strip. Then, once it became impossible to continue denying that there was hunger in the Gaza Strip, we were told, yes, there is hunger in the Gaza Strip, but the reason is that it's all being stolen by Hamas on a systematic, in a systematic manner. And many of Israel's apologists went one step further and said the reason that Hamas is systematically stealing all this food is because the United Nations is working hand in glove with Hamas. Um, that lie, given very wide currency, the BBC, the New York Times, and all the other mainstream Western media outlets, persisted for a while. Now that has been exposed as totally false, as a hoax, essentially, including by people like David Satterfield, who you just mentioned. Once that lie could no longer be used as a pretext to continue the murderous siege in the Gaza Strip, and once incipient famine could no longer be hidden from the global public, Israel simply seamlessly and shamelessly transition to another lie. And that lie is that the reason people are starving to death in the Gaza Strip has nothing to do with the Israeli siege. The only reason these people are dying of hunger is because the United Nations is refusing to provide the available food and supplies to them, apparently for no other reason than it thinks that Palestinians starving to death makes Israel look bad. I mean, imagine how crazy, the premise is that you have specialized humanitarian agencies that are deliberately starving infants, the elderly, small children to death. And why are they doing it? Because they want to make Israel look bad. I mean, it's beyond words. But anyway, so that's the latest line. And of course, the UN has pointed out that the reason it's not distributing these mountains of supplies that are sitting on the Gaza border, that Israel, pictures of which Israel is now showing around the world, and its flunkies, self-proclaimed investigative journalists and specialists and international humanitarian law, even self-proclaimed international human rights lawyers, are basically going there, showing pictures or images of these mountains of food that could literally feed every man, woman, and child in the Gaza Strip for at least 3 months, and saying, here's a food. Why does the UN refuse to distribute it? Well, the UN is not refusing to distribute it. In fact, the UN is desperate to distribute it, but they cannot distribute it without authorization and permission from the occupying power, namely the government of Israel and its military command. Secondly, since this is a conflict zone, they need security assurances from the Israeli authorities that they won't be shot and murdered while delivering the aid to their warehouses. They need safe routes and so on. So, the UN is the one who is desperate to collect and distribute these goods. Israel is the party that is insisting the UN cannot do so, and then turns around and says it's all the UN's fault. And of course gains traction and all the rest of it. But now there's an additional problem, which is that in the last few days, as this latest lie is getting exposed, Israel has begun allowing very limited supplies to be distributed by the United Nations. And the way that the UN agencies do this is they collect the goods and supplies that are sitting on the boundary of the Gaza Strip. They place them in trucks, and then they drive them to warehouses or distribution facilities within the Gaza Strip that have not, if that have not been destroyed, or temporary ones. There, the problem becomes that you have masses of desperate, starving Palestinians determined to feed their families, their children, themselves at any cost, that they will often swarm these trucks or convoys to get hold of whatever they can. And the way that the authorities, the Palestinian authorities in the Gaza Strip, have been addressing this problem is to send security guards to accompany these convoys to ensure that they can reach the distribution center so that everyone can get a meal or some of these supplies. So what does Israel do? It sends snipers to kill these civil security forces. They get shot, the crowd swarms, takes whatever it can, which under the situation is, of course, entirely understandable, but with the result that these supplies never reach the warehouses, the distribution centers. In the southern Gaza Strip, there's a different problem, is that you have collaborationist militias armed by Israel, operating under Israeli protection, that are systematically looting aid that is allowed to enter the Gaza Strip, and then selling it at exorbitant prices on the market, in a situation where the vast majority of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip can no longer afford anything, let alone the kinds of supplies they would need to have a meal to save them from death.
Just returning back to the Israeli propaganda, I'm actually considering having this week's show titled "Israeli Propaganda Reaches Comic Alley Levels," partly because of
Sounds right.
some of the outrageous things they've been saying. And you mentioned the cycle of Israeli propaganda. We see that over and over again. Of course, we know there's Israel is granted considerable latitude by its allies in how it executes the genocide in
Yeah, I would
Gaza.
say considerable is an understatement, but point taken.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and we saw that, for example, in the bombing of Al Ahle Hospital, Baptist Hospital, October 2023, when Israel bombed that hospital. Of course, it blamed Hamas, and
Sorry, I
Israel's
think it blamed Islamic Jihad
Oh yeah,
in it.
Islamic Jihad,
Yeah.
and then when its Western allies, the US and the UK, all said that no, it was Islamic Jihad, Israel was not responsible. I think that was a signal that it can destroy every single hospital in the Gaza Strip, which it set out to do. And over the past year and a half, we've seen exactly that.
Yes.
And I think even with the starvation policy, Israel's been doing exactly that until last week when the images became so horrible. You had people like Starmer and many others coming out and saying that we cannot allow Israel to continue in the manner it's doing. And that, so now I think we're at a stage where I think there is no question that Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war. And this was, something was clearly highlighted by another expert, Alex de Waal, who discussed Israel's use of food as a weapon of war in the Gaza Strip. And I want to quote Alex, I mean, who's been in the humanitarian business for the past 40 years.
Yes.
And he went on to say, in over 40 years of working on famine, food crisis, and humanitarian action, there's no case of such um, minutely engineered, closely monitored, precisely designed mass starvation of a population as is happening in Gaza today. Um, this is quite a revealing statement by someone who's been
Yes.
working in this field for a long, long time, and I think Israel was checking to see how far it can go with this
Precisely.
starvation without the condemnation of its allies in the West. I mean, many flinched. Starmer flinched because I guess from the outrage in the UK. Many others like Macron also is now using the two-state card as a way to make Israel change its behavior. So, just your thoughts on what Alex said and the fact that
Yeah.
Israel is conducting or using starvation
Yeah.
as a weapon of war.
Yeah, well, I mean, Alex de Waal, as you mentioned, is one of the world's foremost authorities on famine, and particularly about the nexus between politics, conflict, and famine. And he previously wrote an extensive article in the London Review of Books where he said the only comparable cases to what is currently happening in the Gaza Strip are the Nazi siege of Leningrad during the Second World War and the Dutch hunger winter during the German occupation in 1944, 1945, towards the conclusion of the Second World War. And, he has his the case he's basically making is that not only does Israel know exactly what it's doing, but that the outcome of its policies were entirely predictable and were in fact the objective of its measures. In other words, when you do something and you know what the result is going to be, you can infer that the reason you're doing something is because that's a result you're seeking to achieve. And this is essentially the argument he is making. And he's also pointing out that the consequences of Israeli policy were entirely predictable from the outset. Now, of course, for Israel and for its apologists and for its flunkies, Israel has no agency. When people starve to death as a direct result of Israel's siege, has nothing to do with Israel. It's Hamas's fault and the fault of the anti-Semites and blood libelers around the world who say starving infants and children to death is bad. Um, when Israel sends snipers to shoot men, women, and children through the head or through the heart at these death traps established by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, it has nothing to do with Israel. You can't hold Israel responsible. It's Hamas's fault. You know, when Israel perpetrates genocide against the Palestinians of the Gaza Strip, has nothing to do with Israel because Israel has no agency. It is always Hamas's fault. It's really incredible that these people are incapable of conceiving that the party doing all the killing, all the destruction, enforcing all the starvation is somehow entirely has absolutely no relationship to any of these actions, that it has zero agency in any of its actions because it's always someone else's fault. Israel is not only blameless, Israel is in fact the victim, you know, and so yes, I think your proposed title for this week's episode is right on the money.
There's two really strong arguments he made in that interview actually he gave, and he said that
Mm,
first, policy of starvation and famine is not like other war crimes. Say, for example, uh, dropping a bomb, for example, which could happen by mistake.
mm.
You could see famine coming miles away. You know,
Yes,
famine requires months and months, if not a year of planning. So he's suggesting that, Israel has been planning this for months and months, and we know what the consequence is going to be. The consequence of Israel's policy in Gaza for the past nearly 2 years has been systematic starvation. And you could see that
precisely.
coming from miles away. It's not like, for example, they just made a mistake and then
Yeah.
boom, there was a bomb in Al Ahli hospital and something, and 300 Palestinians were killed. It's not like that. Famine is different. And secondly, he also points out that um, Netanyahu, if he wanted to, he could, with the phone, issue an order. That's the end of famine. He could have done that, but he's not done that for the last,
Yes, I
20
mean,
months.
yeah, this is not a case where there are logistical complications in the sense of, you have to find a way to bring grain from, intensive conflict zone in Ukraine, find a way to get it on ships and bring it to the Middle East. You know, as I said before,
It's an hour's drive,
it's not only an
literally.
hour's drive, but there is enough food and water and supplies literally sitting on the border of the Gaza Strip, sufficient for the entire population of that territory for at least 3 months. And of course, the reason is it isn't going in. It's Hamas's fault, it's UN's fault, they're extraterrestrials trying to sabotage this, and all kinds of other craziness. The only party that is not responsible is a party that imposed the siege, the party that prohibits anyone from bringing anything into the Gaza Strip. In other words, the party that is overseeing and directing this macabre death camp is the only party that has absolutely nothing to do with it. Imagine it's gotten so bad that you have someone like Keir Starmer who publicly went on the record to defend Israel's right to impose a siege on the Gaza Strip as part of his election campaign. Imagine that even he now feels Israel has gone too far. That's how bad things are.
And
Or
on
at least is
we
saying he
yeah.
feels that Israel has gone too far.
Yeah, we'll get to Starmer, I think, later on. But I
Yeah.
think there's a realization he's lost so many voters now. There's
Yep.
another, Jeremy Corbyn has established a new party. Part of
Yes.
that is a backlash from his position on
Yes.
Gaza.
Of
And
course. Mm,
this new party could effectively become a bigger party than Labour itself. But we'll get to that later on.
mm.
Um, and also, we saw, I don't know what you made of Bob Geldof's contribution. I mean, he did make it, for
No
me, a good
comments.
he made a good point saying that if Israel really want to oppose their prime minister, there's no point demonstrating in front of the Knesset. There's food literally half an hour away. They should drive to Gaza and deliver the food if they really are serious about stopping their government and stopping
Yeah,
the
and if
genocide.
Bob
So I think,
Geldof really gave a damn about this issue, he didn't need to wait 2 years to speak out.
yeah,
That's all
fair,
I
fair
have to
point.
say about it.
Yeah. Fair point. Let's turn. I mean, of course, policy of starvation, famine is part of a much bigger picture of policy to commit genocide in Gaza. And now, last week, B'Tselem, an Israeli human rights organization, published a report. And I think it's worth spending some time on that. The report is called Our Genocide. And I mean, one thing I found really interesting is Section 5. Of course, reports such as the one by B'Tselem would be quite thorough. It began by explaining what is genocide and documented all the different ways Israel is, committing violations, which leads it to conclude that it's genocide. But in Section 5, it goes on to argue that the project of actually creating a state of Israel on Palestine would not be possible without genocide, without the destruction and ethnic cleansing of the native Palestinian population. So it has a whole section on that. Other reports does not really cover this in detail, but B'Tselem goes into basically say that Israel's policy since from the time of its creation of trying to separate Palestinians from the
Yes.
Israelis, which has taken many different forms over the years, that in itself is genocidal, and the genocidal policies are intrinsic to the Zionist aspiration to create a state of Israel, Jewish supremacist state in historic
Mm,
Palestine. I
mm.
thought that was an
Well,
interesting section.
yeah, speaking of waiting for 2 years, of course, many Palestinians have noted that it took B'Tselem and another Israeli human rights organizations, Physicians for Human Rights Israel, that also issued a genocide report on the same day, that it took them 2 years, and have also pointed out that they and Physicians for Human Rights Israel in particular played a role in the early phases of kind of promoting Israeli atrocity propaganda about the Palestinian attacks of October 7th, and have made the point that, not only should you not have waited this long, but we also need some kind of accountability and atonement for the role you played previously. I don't want to dismiss any of that, but at the same time, as others have pointed out, you know, even given the validity of those criticisms, I think it's also important to recognize that, for Israeli human rights organizations, particularly those operating in the absolutely fanatically genocidal society that Israel has become, it's not that easy to reach these conclusions. Not only about your own state, but even, but particularly in this kind of fanatic environment in which they're operating. But what I found interesting is that, let's take the B'Tselem report first. So, as you mentioned, the most human rights organizations who have concluded that Israel is responsible for genocide in the Gaza Strip have looked specifically at its actions since October 2023. Tried to identify intent, conduct, make an organic relationship between the two, and on that basis concluded that Israel is guilty of genocide. I think Human Rights Watch looked specifically at the deprivation of water, and so on. What I thought distinguished B'Tselem is that it didn't just look at the situation since October 2023. As you mentioned, it looked at the decades before 2023. Now, what the report says explicitly in the introduction is that genocide has a very clear definition. It's laid out in the 1948 Genocide Convention, and that is the criteria that B'Tselem is using to evaluate and assess Israeli conduct since October 2023, but that there is also a more expansive um, uh, understanding of genocide put forward by the scholar who basically introduced the concept and the term, Arthur Lemkin. I
Lemnick.
think it was
Lemkin,
Arthur.
sorry. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
And what B'Tselem does is what B'Tselem says is that it is using Lemkin's more expansive understanding of genocide as a process, not to assess Israel's conduct since October 2023, but rather to analyze the process leading up to October 2023 that forms a crucial background and context of the Gaza genocide. And of course, Israel apologists have gone completely apoplectic, saying, look, B'Tselem was only able to conclude that Israel's guilty of genocide because it changed because it used a different definition of genocide. Well, it did absolutely no such thing. It's assessing Israeli conduct since October 2023 by the universally accepted legal definition of genocide, but it is also pointing out that genocide is not just a crime, it is also a process and so on. And for that, to look at the period before, it's using Lemkin's scholarship. And it's looking at its examination and detailing of the background and context and process. I found very interesting because they're basically saying that without understanding the period prior to October 2023, it's very difficult to conclude that a genocide would have happened or to understand why it happened. The second point that the report makes a lot of points, as you mentioned, but a second point that stuck out for me was that, the whole question of intent, of course, because what sets genocide apart from war crimes that killed the same number of people is you have to be able to demonstrate that the perpetrator did so with a specific intent to destroy a particular group in whole or in part. And the same kind of people who said, "Well, where's a memo from Hitler saying gas 6 million Jews?" Are now claiming, "Well, Netanyahu, never published a military order calling for the extermination of the Palestinians. If Israel, really wanted to kill the Palestinians, they'd all be dead," and all that other nonsense. Well, where other human rights reports have determined that Israel did have an intent to commit genocide by looking at all the statements that have been made by by Israeli leaders and military commanders and so on, and then demonstrated that these statements informed the conduct of the military and particularly soldiers in the field, and made that connection. What I found interesting is that B'Tselem goes one step further and says correctly that intent can be inferred not only from statements, but also you can infer intent from the actual conduct of the perpetrator. And compared to other reports, I felt it focuses much more on inferring intent from conduct than simply inferring intent from statements and so on. The third point is that B'Tselem, of course, also points out that the Genocide Convention is not just about punishing genocide. In other words, this is not a convention that requires states to respond to a genocide after it ends, count the number of children that have been starved to death, and then try to hold those responsible for the famine to account. But equally important is prevention, and that states have a positive obligation to do everything within their power to prevent a genocide, and once a genocide commences, to bring it to a stop as rapidly as possible. In other words, you don't have an excuse for waiting until it ends and then say, "Oh, oops, too late." And it focuses also on measures that um, uh, other states should take against Israel, which I do think it's worth pointing out, their own government what measures foreign states should take against their own government to bring this genocide to an immediate end. The other report by Physicians for Human Rights Israel covers much of the same ground, but focuses much more on the destruction of the health sector as a marker of genocide, and how that demonstrates a determination by Israel to bring about the destruction of society in the Palestinian society in the Gaza Strip, and genocide. And I should just add, both these reports, I presume they're in Hebrew, but they've both were published simultaneously on Monday in English. Web search for Physicians for Human Rights Israel or B'Tselem will immediately take you to these reports. And I think these are well worth the hour or two that may be required to read them to get a better understanding. And of course, I think should also be read in conjunction with the other authoritative reports by authoritative Palestinian and international human rights agencies, as well as the various submissions to the International Court of Justice, which, of course, will be the one that will make the formal legal determination on genocide pursuant to South Africa's case against Israel, which by now I think seems more or less a foregone conclusion, unless a bunker buster is dropped on the Peace Palace in The Hague first, which unfortunately at this stage I wouldn't exclude. But again, these reports, like so many others who have discussed the Gaza genocide, have pointed out, yes, genocide has a legal definition. I think actually this is a point made by Alex de Waal in one of his articles, that genocide has a legal definition and the determination requires a legal ruling, but genocide is also a moral and political category that requires us to act, and to act as rapidly as possible, because prevention is as important, arguably more important, than punishment.
Yeah, and I found that to be quite a strong argument from the B'Tselem report as well. And I think reading it, I think my view on Israel-Palestine, I think, is more in line with B'Tselem's conclusion here, because it takes more of a historical approach, and it shows that the policy of racial segregation is something that's deeply wedded to the Zionist project, and
Yeah.
apartheid and various policies of separation eventually leads to a trigger moment, and it frames the October 7th attack as the trigger moment, which gave Israel the justification to use security threat to go after Hamas and what and commit the atrocities and the famine and the killing and the total annihilation, destruction of Gaza that we are seeing now.
Yes.
So in that process, the destruction of Gaza is like the um, final stage in the
Yeah.
process of genocide. And I thought that it makes that's a quite a compelling argument, starting from 1948 all the way to where we
Yeah.
are now. It of course includes the West Bank as part of its study of how Israel is committing genocide. It's not just
Yeah.
Gaza, but it's also in the
Yeah.
occupied West Bank.
Yeah, that's a good point. If I could just comment on that, I think, if you compare this to the Holocaust, it's not as if Germany woke up one day in 1941 and said, let's gas all the Jews. No, it had been preceded by a decade of the Nazis in power, of increasingly draconian measures, persecution evolving into mass murder and so on. And so it has precursors, it has background, it has context. And the other reason I raised the German Holocaust is that for many people, when they think of genocide, of course, they immediately think of the Holocaust during the Second World War, where the Jews, they didn't have an army, they hadn't attacked Germany. There was no military precursor, if you will, to the German campaign to exterminate Europe's Jews. And the B'Tselem report on this issue makes, I think, a crucial point, that the Holocaust was actually an outlier in the sense that it was not a response to a real or perceived military attack or threat, but that typically, when you're talking about genocide, the catalyst is a military action emerging from within the population that is the victim of genocide, a military action that is perceived as an existential threat um, uh, by the society whose leadership commits the genocide. So, in that respect, you know, of course, Israel and its apologists like to constantly say, well, you shouldn't have started a war, as if it all began on October 7th, this their favorite phrase, FAFO, and so on. And what the B'Tselem report clarifies is that it is very typical that the catalyst for genocide is often a military action emerging from within the society, that is then subjected to genocide. And of course, the other point that is made by all these reports is that what distinguishes genocide is that there can be no justification for it under any circumstances. Many military actions or under criminal law, if you're in court, you can put forward extenuating circumstances or justifications why you were compelled to act that way, and could be found innocent. But if you are found to have committed genocide, you are by definition guilty because you cannot bring any reasoning or justifications or extenuating circumstances to bear that would allow you to in any way argue that you were somehow entitled to perpetrate genocide. That's why it's called the crime of crimes.
Let's turn our attention to something we've discussed in previous shows, which is the allegation that Hamas has been stealing food. Last week, USAID provided its own analysis and found that there is no evidence of massive theft of food by Hamas. And this was again another one of those pillars of Israeli propaganda used to completely dismantle the aid distribution, and Israel taking aid distribution from civilian organizations like the UN and militarizing the entire aid distribution, which, as we see now, it has become a death zone for many Gazans. One of the staff who was a Green Beret working for the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, who returned, and now his testimonies have been quite horrific. He's saying that
Yes.
Palestinians were directly shot, and one Palestinian, 5-year-old Palestinian, he was giving aid to, was shot a few seconds after he gave that person aid. There's some really horrific testimonies from that Green Beret.
Mm.
And now, so that's one of the many hoaxes Israel perpetrated, promoted, to manufacture consent for what we are seeing now.
Yes.
Um, and this now has collapsed, but it collapsed because I mean, from an unusual source. I didn't expect US aid to produce, or come to the conclusion it has, which is to say that, Hamas is not stealing food, or not stealing food in the
This
way.
was an older report, or wasn't it?
No, this is last week.
I see.
USAID came out. Yeah, USAID just came out and
Ah,
and,
because
and
I
said
thought
that,
USA doesn't exist anymore, so my
no,
mistake.
no,
Mm.
no.
Mm.
And yeah, so I mean, I guess, I mean, it's another pillar of Israeli propaganda
Yeah,
collapsing
I
in
mean,
front of our eyes.
yeah, I mean, when the party that's giving you all the weapons, and that is a chief sponsor of the genocide, and that is the one working around the clock to ensure that you can commit genocide with total impunity. When even that sponsor comes out and says, actually, the pretext you're giving for imposing the siege doesn't exist. Well, that should mean something. I'm sorry, I had thought the reference to the USAID report was that the issue had been looked into previously and found to be absolutely baseless. But it's interesting that
Yeah,
that
Reuters
even
reported it
now,
widely.
yeah,
Sorry, yeah.
yeah, mm,
Let's move on. I mean, I wanted to. The other big topic from last week is the collapse of the ceasefire talk between Hamas and Israel. So Steve Witkoff, the U.S. envoy to the Middle East, he issued a statement on X and he appeared to blame Hamas. But ultimately, what it boils down to again is Israel insisting on continuing its genocidal policy after the
yes,
release of the hostages, and Hamas insisting on that the ceasefire would be a prelude to a long-term truce or peace, and Israel would withdraw. We're back to where we were more or less, 18, 20, nearly 2 years ago, where
yes.
Hamas is seeking to end the
And
genocide, where Israel is seeking to continue the genocide after the release of hostages. And there's no way of squaring that circle, it seems.
mm, yes, well, it's quite difficult to reach any firm conclusions about what's going on, and I think an important part of the reason is that Washington under Trump is completely unpredictable, often very impulsive, prone to self-contradiction, and so on. So there are basically two or three versions out of what's happening now. One is that, the manner in which Witkoff announced the U.S. withdrawal from the negotiations and the manner in which he condemned Hamas as a party responsible um, had all the hallmarks of a pressure tactic. In other words, that what the United States was trying to do was kind of squeeze some additional concessions out of Hamas in order to reach a deal. And that version would seem to be supported by reporting out of Israel that the Israelis did not consider the talks as having collapsed and expected negotiations to continue. The other version is that the U.S. Uh, has indeed written off these talks because it's it's not willing to meet Hamas's core minimum conditions for an agreement and is unwilling to pressure Israel to accept those conditions. And let's just recall that the three non-negotiable demands, as far as Hamas is concerned, are a credible pathway to a permanent end to Israel's genocidal military campaign in the Gaza Strip, a credible plan for an Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, or at least one beginning with an Israeli withdrawal to the positions it held before it repudiated the cessation of hostilities in March of this year. And third, the lifting of meaningful restrictions on the supply of humanitarian assistance and other essential goods to the Gaza Strip. And what we've been hearing from the Israeli government in the past few days is that they have taken a decision to begin with the gradual permanent reoccupation, annexation of territory from the Gaza Strip, unless and until Hamas accedes to their demands. So I find either scenario equally plausible. It may be the case that the U.S. Has indeed decided to move on to better things like squeezing hundreds of billions of dollars out of the European Union and is no longer interested in the Gaza Strip. It's also possible that it was a negotiating tactic and that it's working hand in glove with the Israelis to seek to force Hamas to accept additional Israeli demands. And then, if it does, there will be an agreement. If it doesn't, the Americans will say, well, this is the best we could achieve, and there will be an agreement anyway. I would like to make one last point about these Israeli statements about annexing Gaza Strip territory. Netanyahu has also stated that he would be doing so with the approval of the United States and of the Trump administration. I think that may or may not be the case, but I think we should also view this as a trial balloon. He's throwing out this proposal to see how his sponsors and allies react. Will Brussels, will London, will Berlin, will Paris pretend they didn't hear anything, in which case Israel will go one step further? Or will they stand up and say, if you actually go through with this, here are the consequences? And in that case, Israel, as it always does, will back off. I'm not holding my breath
Mm.
on anything emerging from the Europeans, but I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah. And talking of consequences, I mean, I want to end with a discussion about recognition of Palestinian statehood. Starmer has issued a statement today, and also France last week, Macron, president of France, said that he will recognize a Palestinian state. And there's been a lot of condemnation of that from the Israeli side, of course, and from the Americans. But before I do that, I wanted to ask you about this really shady figure, a militant ISIS-linked individual in the Gaza Strip by the name of Abu Shabab. So, guy, of course, does not speak English, but somehow he managed to get an article in the Wall Street Journal. And I mean, it's curious how he's been allowed to push the narrative he's pushing. But it now turns out a really good research was done by Drop Site News, and
Yes.
they found that Abu Shabab, along with Barry Wise's The Free Press, they've basically
Free, yeah.
become vehicles of laundering Israeli propaganda. We saw something like this in I think back in 2024 when the German newspaper The Bild and the Jewish Chronicle, they were publishing fake intelligence to push Netanyahu's narrative about the hostage. I don't know if you recall,
Mm.
the viewers anyway, where they were publishing articles saying that Sinwar was looking to move the hostages through the tunnel to Iran, and that narrative supported Netanyahu, and that was
Yeah.
complete fabrication. Now it turns out people like Abu Shabab, who's Israel is seen as a challenger to Hamas, and then he is part of a much bigger a vehicle of pushing pro-Israeli narrative and propaganda in the Western media. And he has managed to get an article in the Wall Street Journal.
Imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean he's not a challenger to Hamas in the way that Fatah or any other movement is a challenger to Hamas because he doesn't have a political program. He doesn't have a political movement. He's the head of a gang, literally. And rather than being a challenger to Hamas, he's an Israeli agent of chaos in the Gaza Strip. Now, you said he doesn't speak English, but the issue is not that he couldn't have written this article in English, because then you could say, well, he wrote it in Arabic and it was translated for him. He is illiterate. He does not know how to write in any language. And so clearly, he didn't dictate it either. I mean, this is a drug smuggler and a gangster. Who has been linked to ISIS. This is not a person who, okay, granted, you don't need a level of sophistication to write an opinion piece for the Wall Street Journal. I take the point, but this is not a person who is even capable of producing an opinion piece for a school newspaper, let alone a national newspaper. And so, as Drop Site News and others have pointed out, it was written for him. And then the question becomes, who has written for him? Well, we know that his gang is based in an area called Dihniya. Now, Dihniya is a small village that sits right on the border between Israel and the Gaza Strip, the boundary there by Rafah, so in the extreme southwest corner. And it was traditionally used by the Israelis to house collaborators who had been exposed, collaborators from the Gaza Strip whose work had been exposed or who faced danger, and they and their families would be relocated to Dehniya. That's where Abu Shabab's base of operations is. He's basically an Israeli agent. He's armed by Israel, he's supported by Israel, he carries out his actions, primarily looting and killing, under Israeli supervision and at Israel's behest. And what DropSite concluded was that the same organization that is a main sponsor of Barry Weiss, whose free press is determined to determined to eliminate freedom of expression in the United States on matters related to Israel. I can't remember the name of the Center for Peace Communications or something like that. It's
Something like
called,
this, right? Yeah.
and it has, various pro-Israel luminaries on its board, among whom is Dennis Ross. That piece may well have been drafted or reviewed or edited by Dennis Ross. Who knows? Um, Most likely, one of this organization's staff, but it was basically written by Israel to promote an Israeli agenda. And the Wall Street Journal, it's a Murdoch paper. Of course, it's going to be a willing platform for this kind of garbage. I take that as a given.
Mm. But let's end with Macron saying that he will recognize a Palestinian state. Today, Starmer has used the recognition of a Palestinian state as a kind of a threat to change Israel's behavior. So, I mean, how you can use someone's right as a threat to change behavior, that's morally, to me, seems really questionable. So I guess why now? Why is Starmer making those statements? And also, I think when we talk about two states, why uh, Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries are desperate to normalize relationship with Israel, and I think the only thing that's stopping them is the fact that there is no Palestinian state. If Israel was to accept a Palestinian state, all the Arab countries, as they have said, would normalize relationship with Israel. Israel would be accommodated into the region. This is like a win-win for everybody. But Israel rejects that outright. So I guess why does it fear two states? Not advocating that as a solution myself. I'm saying why does Israel fear that when this is its pathway, its route to normalization, its route to being accommodated into the region, its route to peace with everybody in the region? Why does it not do that? And also going back to the other point, what is Starmer doing by using the two state as kind of a threat against the Israelis?
Well, I think first we have to recognize that Israel has become a compulsively expansionist state. It is simply incapable of retreating from occupied territory, except, as in the case of the Sinai Peninsula after the 1973 war or southern Lebanon in 2000, except as a result of armed force. And it's certainly not going to do so in the West Bank, which it considers to be, the heartland of Jewish existence. Even though I should point out during the Mandate period, the Zionist movement, when it was talking about Judea, was not referring to the southern West Bank, but to the coastal area, roughly between Jaffa and the Gaza Strip. So I just wanted to throw out that tidbit. So yes, it makes eminent sense um, for Israel to at least be seen to take serious measures towards the establishment of a Palestinian state, but it's incapable of doing so. And of course, it will say, security threats and all the rest of it. Whereas anyone who's ever looked at this with a even halfway open mind understands that the only reason Israel needs to worry about its security is because of its oppression and apartheid policies against the Palestinians. And it basically, when you reject peaceful coexistence, you're not going to get peaceful coexistence. And it's that simple. Now, Macron's gamble appears to have paid off. What I mean by that is that over the summer, we saw repeated statements coming out of Paris that the French president, Emmanuel Macron, wanted to put recognition of Palestinian statehood on the agenda, but for maximum effect, he wanted to do this in as part of a broader coalition of the willing, if you will. Germany, forget it. And the two states that he chose, interestingly enough, were Great Britain, which is no longer a member of the EU, and Canada, which is, of course, the immediate neighbor of the United States. And the significance would be that here you have three G7 members. I believe all three are G7 members that would simultaneously recognize a Palestinian state. It seemed that fearing the US backlash, London and Ottawa didn't proceed. And Macron then took a unilateral French initiative last week in which he announced that France intends to formally recognize Palestinian statehood at the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly this fall. It's a statement of intent, it's not a statement of recognition. A lot can happen in the interim. Now, what happened in Britain is that on the one hand, you have a lot of members of the Labour Party, of the Parliamentary Labour Party, who either genuinely believe that their country, which after all created this whole problem, should recognize Palestinian statehood, or are terrified of losing the next election because British public opinion, particularly in Labour constituencies, is so overwhelmingly supportive of Palestinian self-determination. And now you have this threat of a new party to the left of Labour, led by Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana. That's not that's probably not going to form the next government, but can ensure that a lot of current Labour members of Parliament will no longer be members of Parliament after the next election. So you have this absolutely crazy situation now where someone like Wes Streeting, the Minister of Health, and probably the most pro-Israeli Brit since Arthur James Balfour, is, is
Held his seat by only 600 votes.
yes, is now pretending that Palestinians are human beings as far as he's concerned, for exactly the reason you mentioned. He
To a
almost
Palestinian.
lost the election. Yeah, so that's the dynamic. I have and in that context, Keir Starmer at this a conference organized at the United Nations by France and co-organized by France and Saudi Arabia, Keir Starmer on Tuesday said that if that Britain intends to recognize Palestinian statehood at the UN General Assembly meeting if Israel does not take concrete steps to do one or the other. But it seems that Macron, his initiative, created a wave of pressure on Starmer to do this, and appears to have worked. We'll see what happens next in Canada, which of course sits right across the border from the United States. And I think that was Starmer's approach too. More frightened of Daddy in the White House than he is of his own people and his own voters. But there's a broader issue here. Yes, recognition is politically symbolic and politically significant, particularly when it comes from, in this case now, two G7 members, and just as importantly, two members of the United Nations Security Council. I mean, if it indeed happens. But if it is not paired, in fact, preceded by energetic action to end the famine in the Gaza Strip, if it is not paired with concrete action to end the genocide in the Gaza Strip, if you have recognition on the one hand, arms deliveries to Israel on the other hand, it becomes political theater and a diversion. So the real challenge for France, for Britain, for all these other states, is not whether they will finally recognize Palestinian statehood, which the rest of the world has already done decades ago, but rather will they use their uniquely powerful leverage over Israel to bring this horrific genocide to an end. In Britain's case, a special responsibility, of course, because it created this whole issue after the First World War. Without Britain, we wouldn't be having this conversation, let alone talk about it every week. And in France's case, because people often forget that before 1967, Israel's main arms supplier was not the United States, it was France. And it was France that enabled Israel to illegally develop a nuclear arsenal.
Fascinating. Thank you, Moin. As always, pleasure to talk to you. So
Thank
we'll
you.
return again next week for another an hour and 10 minutes of discussion on Palestine, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more to talk about. And thank you for tuning in at home. See you next week. Bye bye.
Okay.